Watching a review on the latest CPU, you might feel a bit left out. Whether it's a fancy schmancy X3D or Core Ultra, or something more down to earth, they're always being paired with RTX 5090s, half-kilowatt monster GPUs capable of churning out hundreds of frames per second at ultra settings. Maybe that's all well and good for John D. Oligarch with his trust fund and his personal Diablo 4 assistant, but most people will never find themselves in that situation. We all know our CPUs are capable of high FPS, but can the average gamer really get the most out of them? This is a Ryzen 5 5600, a Zen 3 based AMD 6-core from 2022, and it's a weirdly relevant CPU right now. The AM4 socket remains popular with PC enthusiasts, mainly because nobody can afford to upgrade to DDR5 memory due to the ongoing Ramageddon. However, most of the attention goes to chips like the 5500X3D and 5800X3D, as their 3D V-cache lets them compete with some of the later AM5 models that are out of reach for many people in 2026. You could perhaps imagine someone pairing one of those with a high-end graphics card, maybe even an RTX 5090. But the regular old 5600 is more likely to be matched up with something more humble. The Geforce RTX 5060 is a disappointing graphics card to many people. It's still lagging behind the 3060 in terms of VRAM quantity, and it's only just comparable to a 4060 Ti in terms of performance. But that hasn't stopped it from being popular with gamers. At a street price of just under £300 or just over $300, it's infinitely more likely to be partnered with this CPU than anything you'd see in a benchmarking video. It has only 30% of the performance of a 5090 and 25% of the VRAM, and has only 8 lanes of PCIe connectivity, so there are plenty of potential bottlenecks to optimal performance. Ordinarily, I wouldn't use a GPU like this in a CPU review. The idea of using the highest end graphics cards is to make the GPU invisible and focus exclusively on how many frames the CPU can handle, and the 5060 would introduce too many of its own limitations into the testing. However, a pretty common thing to see in the comments under a budget CPU review is a request for benchmarks with something more realistic in the PCIe slot, and I thought this might be the time to give that a try. Of course, it's possible to use even lower end GPUs than a 5060, but that would involve ridiculously low resolutions and quality settings. My goal was to see if I could create a CPU bottleneck without resorting to testing in potato quality and standard def. I paired the R5 5600 with the RTX 5060, along with 32 gigs of DDR4 3600 RAM and a B550 motherboard, and I ran through my usual test suite with the 5090 first to set a benchmark to compare to. As we're all aware of by now, ray and path tracing have an impact on the CPU as well as the GPU. With settings maxed out, even the 5090 can only hit just over 60 FPS on average in Cyberpunk 2077, and it's nothing to do with the GPU. Simply swapping out the 5090 for the 5060 without making a single change to the settings only cuts the average to 39 FPS. A big drop, certainly, but not the kind you'd expect from a 70% reduction in horsepower. At these settings, the 5060 is holding the Ryzen back, and not the other way around, and the frame times are being absolutely destroyed by the limited 8GB frame buffer. So, to re-establish a CPU bottleneck, I needed to make a few changes. As it turns out, it didn't need much. I kept the same render resolution, changing from 1440p output with performance DLSS to 1080p with DLSS quality, which shouldn't make much of a difference but felt more relatable in this context. However, I also swapped the RT Overdrive preset for RT Ultra, and that seemed to be enough. The reduced settings bring the average FPS to 57, which is closer but still about 10% short of the benchmark results. With ray tracing disabled, the benchmark shows that the 5600 is now capable of around 72 FPS. With no settings adjusted and only the output resolution changed, the 5060 is still close to the benchmark result, averaging 70 FPS with near identical 1% and 0.1% lows. You can get even higher performance by reducing crowd density. All of my testing so far shows CPU limited gains of around 30% simply by dropping this setting from high to low. But I forgot to run those benchmarks this time. Sorry. At the beginning of my test run through the city of Hernand, Crimson Desert starts out pretty light on the CPU, only really starting to get demanding once I find myself around more and more NPCs. The benchmark test was done at max settings, including super heavy stuff like ray reconstruction, and swapping the 5090 for the 5060 drops the average from 81 to 44, with percentile lows in the 30s. Disabling ray reconstruction alone almost doubled the frame rate, but at least at the start of the run it still looked pretty GPU bound, so I took the extra step of reducing from the cinematic preset to high. This still didn't quite ease the GPU bottleneck, as it was still around the 90 to 100% utilization mark much of the time, but it was enough to get to 77 FPS on average, just 5% off the benchmark results. Resident Evil Requiem is another title that features path tracing, and to be fair, the Ryzen 5600 can actually handle it. The benchmark test with the RTX 5090 averages 87 FPS, and this is in the very demanding street scene at the start of the game. Unfortunately, swapping out the GPU shows that the 5060 isn't up to the path tracing challenge, averaging 34 FPS at the same settings. Even dropping quality to normal couldn't force a CPU bottleneck, and it only gained about 6 more frames. Part of this is once more down to the limited VRAM. The settings menu has a memory warning indicator, and it didn't give the all clear to any settings that included path tracing or even ray tracing, so to find the CPU limits, I'd have to skip RT altogether. The rasterized test now reaches 115 FPS at normal quality, a little over 10% behind the benchmark of 130 FPS, but still clearly not CPU limited. Dropping to lowest quality and turning off hair strands actually pushes the 5060 beyond the benchmark results to an average of 140. So clearly there's some CPU power going into maintaining those luxurious locks, but I did say I wouldn't consider this a success if I had to sacrifice image quality by this much, so I can't really call it a win. Meanwhile, finding the CPU bottleneck in Death Stranding 2 was much easier. Again, the 5060 isn't up to the task of running ultra settings at high frame rates, but all I needed to match the benchmark was to drop the quality preset to high. Now the game's running within margin of error of the 5090 at over 90 FPS on average. I'm not exactly surprised, but Baldur's Gate 3 didn't need a single setting or resolution change when swapping to the 5060. The RTX 5090 was less than 30% utilised in the city, and only running at a fraction of its usual TDP. Meanwhile, at least according to Tech PowerUp, the 5060 is about 30% of a 5090. Baldur's Gate 3 is once again roughly 10% slower than the benchmark run, a difference big enough to measure but not really enough to notice, and the game should still look excellent to boot. In fact, even the 5060 is running at about half capacity, so you could increase the render resolution and still be enjoying a frame rate of around 87 FPS. The benchmark run through The Last of Us Part 2 sees the Ryzen 5 5600 limited to a maximum of around 128 FPS, and matching that with the RTX 5060 is going to be a bit of a tall order. I think the 8GB frame buffer isn't helping any, as both of the games in this series are known for being memory hogs, but a straight GPU swap sees an average of under 70 FPS. Dropping quality to high delivers a sizable improvement, pushing 115 FPS and only a few points short of the benchmark result. But the GPU is still the limiting factor, so we'd have to drop quality or resolution to get there. Like with Resident Evil, Doom's path tracing mode is far too much for the 5060 without making compromises elsewhere. RT is integral to the game, so upgrading it to path tracing doesn't really have a massive impact on the CPU, but it is incredibly heavy on the GPU and uses a ton of VRAM, and the 5060 is utterly overwhelmed. Skipping the path trace testing, I found that dropping texture size to its lowest and overall quality to nightmare achieved over 100 FPS, but the GPU is still the bottleneck. In fact, dropping quality further barely made a difference. Even at low, the average is only 117, and the GPU is still at 90 to 100% utilization. So, short of using heavier upscaling and tearing image quality to shreds, I don't think it's possible to force the CPU bottleneck with a 5060. You don't need high FPS in Hitman World of Assassination. It's a social stealth puzzle game dressed up as a murder simulator, but that's not why it's a good benchmark for CPUs. I was watching Annie Austin's video about video game nightclubs the other day, and I was fascinated to see the sheer number of NPCs in the Berlin rave level. I really need to play this game one of the days. Anyway, the number of NPCs, as well as the simulation of physics like explosions and shattering objects and people falling to their deaths, are all part of what makes this game so demanding on a CPU. The simulation has two levels of fidelity, base and best. At base quality, there are very few actual physics effects, and the game is more GPU limited. The 5060 isn't capable enough to overpower the CPU, and even at medium quality the frame rate is 128, about 8 or 9% below the limits of the 5600. Meanwhile, turning simulation up to best shifts the pressure onto the Ryzen's shoulders, and it can't really handle it. The average is in the high 80s, but lows are in the 30s and 40s. Unfortunately, this is an area where only modern 8 cores and higher can really maintain a 60 plus at all times, and by that I mean an AM5 chip like a 7700 or 9700X, or a 5700X 3D at bare minimum. As always, I have to preface the multiplayer game tests with a disclaimer. It's not within my ability to do a 100% fair comparison in an online game. CPU utilization can be impacted by any number of factors outside of my control, so take these with a grain of salt. That being said, it was not that hard to force a CPU bottleneck in Arc Raiders, and in fact, the 5060 very slightly outperformed the benchmark. I made a couple of settings adjustments, dropping the quality preset and RTGI to high, which resulted in a 116 FPS average, 4.5 frames more than the 5090. Battlefield 6 once again required a heavy hand when it came to quality settings, purely to avoid the VRAM warning. At 1080p high with low textures and DLSS-Q, the game is very playable, but the 5060 is still the limiting factor to frame rate, and the average of around 120 FPS is a couple of points short of where the 5600 is truly capable of. Reaching that requires dropping quality to low, which is still keeping GPU utilization in the 90s, but rarely hits 100, and the average FPS is now 144, pretty much the same as the benchmark. The RTX 5060 puts up a good fight. In more than a few instances, it has enough horsepower to outpace the Ryzen 5 5600, and if we cherry-pick those specific titles, you could say this project was a success. I think a 5060 Ti or 9060 XT would perhaps have been even more successful, especially the 16GB models, but in my opinion they're a bit too expensive to call ordinary. Still, while the 5060 failed to hit the target in a number of more demanding games, especially when testing with ray or path tracing, even when it failed, it was pretty close, and I didn't have to turn the graphics into mush to achieve it. Does this mean that I'll be doing more CPU reviews with the 5060? No, not at all. I got pretty lucky with how this turned out, and if I tried the same thing with a 5500X 3D it wouldn't have worked nearly as well. that CPU is 15 to 30% faster across the board, so I'd need to step up to a 4070 or RX 6900 XT, and then we're kinda losing the message about CPU bottlenecks for ordinary people. I'll be returning to the 5090 for my future CPU benchmarks, but I hope those viewers who felt left out by that can understand that the choice of a high-end GPU in a CPU review doesn't mean that other, more realistically priced models can't keep up. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.